Well, good morning, Wildwood congregation. It's wonderful to be here, and let me just say thank you for sharing Lizzie with us. I'm sure our congregation is so excited to hear a diverse voice that you get to hear in an awesome way here. So again, thank you. It's a real privilege to be here today. Now, I've never been introduced as Don Froese before. However, my mother was a Friesen. And if my parents would have, had a hyphenated name, I could have been Don Froese, or, there was always those Friesen to Froese jokes anyway, but we won't go there. Well, thank you for reading that very long scripture and story. I appreciate it. And hopefully you'll remember the story as we go through the message today. So do you remember a time when you have been so thirsty, so desperate for a drink of water that you were just parched and dry, and then when you finally got your hands on that water bottle or that garden hose if you were a kid, and you drank, it just tasted so good? Well, hopefully you remember some of those times. I thought of lots of examples, but one that comes to me right away was in my college years. I went tree planting in the summers. And any fellow tree planters out there, by any chance? Okay. Well, this was in northern Alberta, northern BC, and these were hot 12-hour days in the sun with huge heavy bags full of these pine plugs, carrying your shovel, and you spent the whole day planting trees, and you got paid like 8 to 10 cents a tree. So you had to work really, really hard if you were going to make any money. Anyway, your water would be hiding underneath a tarp where all the trees were in the shade because you didn't want to carry extra weight. And so when you had your long line back and forth, you were so dry and so thirsty. And I remember those hot summer days, water never tasted so good. Now, by any chance, do any of you remember road trips before air conditioning? Okay, some of you do. Some of you are going, road trips without air conditioning? How many of you remember driving down a gravel road in a vehicle with no air conditioning, and you had to decide between baking to death inside the car with no windows down, or rolling down the windows and dying from all the dust coming in from the road? Remember that? Yeah. I remember going over the Rockies as a kid in a no air-conditioned, packed car with my siblings. We're so hot and sweating. We're driving through the mountains. All of those delays because of construction where you're dying even more, but at least you can get out of the car for a while. And remember like the little waterfalls that would come down? And then I'd beg my dad, pull over, and we'd dunk our heads under one of them just to cool off for a while. So, I don't know, I love road trips, and I'm so thankful for air conditioning. But man, there are times when you are so dry that water feels and tastes so good. Now, the story that you heard read from John chapter 4 is the story of a thirsty Jesus asking for water and then offering the gift of living water to a woman who was thirsty for hope. I want to read for you Revelation 22, verse 17. You'll see it on the screen. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come." Let the one who hears say, "Come." And let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who wishes to receive life-giving water as a gift. Now, if you remember the beginning of the story, the author said that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, maybe you didn't catch the had to go through Samaria and why that was an issue. But here's what the issue was. At that time in Palestine, the Jews lived in two regions. Most of them lived around Jerusalem in the area called Judea, and many of them lived north of that by the Sea of Galilee in an area, of course, called Galilee. The problem was that in between Judea and Galilee was this place called Samaria, and Samaria was full of people that they hated and despised called Samaritans. Now, when I think of this, it reminds me of one of my favorite movies, which is the movie Braveheart. And I don't know if you have seen that movie, but there's this scene where the English king is lamenting about Scotland. And this scene cracks me up every time because I have a Scottish mother-in-law and an Irish actor father-in-law. And he would love to quote this line to her in a perfect English accent. Anyway, this king would say, "The only problem with Scotland is it's full of Scots." So that kind of would have been the attitude. Now, the reasons for this deep prejudice and hatred is complicated and historical. I won't get into all of that. But the basic idea was that the Jews hated the Samaritans because they basically considered them traitors, or, sorry to use this term, but half-breeds, because they had intermingled with other nations and other people groups, and they were no longer pure-blooded Jews. And that reached into many areas of life, including their religious traditions, and so they thought that they had legit reason to hate these people. Now, the Jews hated the Samaritans in Samaria so much that even though if you wanted to travel from Judea to Galilee, or vice versa, to visit relatives or do whatever you needed to do to visit your other Jewish family or friends, if you went through Samaria, it was only a 3-day walk. But most of them chose to go around either way to make it a 5 to 7-day journey, depending on the route you took. And you're walking the whole time in dry and dusty, hot Palestine. Lots of deep, deep hatred there. Now, recently in our fine city of Saskatoon, I've been hearing more and more people say to me, I don't go downtown anymore. And I question it and go, well, how come? And they don't talk about traffic or parking, and they don't really want to say why. But what I kind of gather when I overhear some of these comments is people don't want to see unhoused, marginalized, desperate people. They would rather avoid it. And they like to make it out like it's just a safety issue. And for vulnerable people, yes. But there's something that just kind of grinds in me when I hear that. I don't go downtown anymore. Now, the first Mennonite church that I served in a few years ago was Mount Royal Mennonite. And during that time that I was there, I live in Buena Vista, so my driving route was to cross the Idlewild Bridge and either go down 20th Street or 22nd Street to drive to Mount Royal Church. Now, most of the time, I would drive down 20th. And of course, driving down 20th, you go past all of the different agencies that reach out to the community and to the homeless of the area, going by the Friendship Inn, seeing the lineup of people. And at that time, Prairie Harm Reduction was still open. Sadly, it's not, but I would turn at Avenue P and just see so many people. Now, when I drove that route, I had very mixed feelings. I'd feel a lot of sadness, but I'd also feel a lot of gratitude for the many excellent organizations and institutions that are serving people. And I would have those mixed feelings every day in my drive to work. I have to confess, though, that there were times that I just didn't want to see and didn't want to feel. And so I drove down 22nd Street. And I'd always feel this pang inside. Sometimes it's good and right to see, and good and right to feel. And I've been so thankful as I've journeyed in the last few years in the Mennonite church world and in the different churches and with MCC to meet and be inspired by so many people that even go beyond that and that are engaging and serving and giving to marginalized people in our city. And it's such a beautiful thing to see. So, back to our story. Jesus gave hope and fought for hope, even over deep hatred and prejudice. Now, as the story continues, Jesus meets a woman at the well, asks for a drink, and they get into a conversation. Now, this woman is famously known as the Samaritan woman or the woman at the well. Now, I read a great article. You see the book up there, an article from this author named Sarah Bessey. And the article she wrote was called Shaming and Other Ways to Disqualify Women's Experiences. And in this article, she talks about how this story about the Samaritan woman, and these are her words, is often misunderstood, misrepresented, minimized, and misjudged. And in my experience of growing up hearing sermons on this story, and I hope this wasn't your experience, but it was my experience that this was very true. Now, it's very interesting that, well, no, it's interesting later. What isn't interesting is that in our Western tradition, the Samaritan woman is just unnamed. However, in Eastern Orthodox tradition, she's named. Her name is Photine, or also Saint Phoenicia of Samaria. She, like Mary Magdalene, are given the title equal to the apostles. Interesting. In Eastern Orthodox tradition, her identity is not about being a Samaritan or about someone of questionable character or a hurting, desperate, needy person. That's not her identity. In their tradition, she is the one that brought the good news of Jesus to the Samaritan nation. She is Saint Phoenicia of Samaria, a very, very different view of who this woman was. So in this article I read, Bessie challenges readers to see the false perceptions and interpretations that has often come around this misunderstood and misrepresented woman. Now, backing this up with lots of other commentators I studied on this, there's several ways I'll suggest to you that we've been influenced to understand this story, I would say not exactly correctly. Now, if you remember in the story, this incident between Jesus and the Samaritan woman happens in the middle of the day at noon. Often it's speculated, why is she coming to the well at noon? What was common in the culture of the day was that the women were the ones that did the water carrying, but they would come very, very early in the morning to avoid the heat of the day. So the theory has been she was there alone at noon because the other women ostracized her because of her questionable life and character. Now, some of the commentators I studied suggest that perhaps what this is more about is that the author of this text is actually wanting to do a contrast. And the contrast is between the Samaritan woman and someone we meet in the chapter before, John chapter 3. Now, in John chapter 3, we meet a man named Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is an educated male Jew. Now, this Nicodemus wanted to see Jesus, but he snuck to see Jesus at night so that no one would see him. Whereas Jesus goes to the Samaritan woman in the bright sun of the middle of the day. And again, the idea here is contrast and kind of showing that contrast. Nicodemus coming secretly at night, but Jesus coming in the open in the bright of day. Now, beyond that, this woman, as well as the narrator, reveal that the social norms of that day meant that men did not address unknown women in public, and Jews did not associate with Samaritans, of course. So, Jesus is defying all these norms and talking openly with her and asking for a drink of water. And remember, she points out, you don't even have something to drink from. Well, part of the issue was, how are you going to drink if you don't have a bucket? But she also knew that the Jews would have considered her bucket ceremonially unclean, and no Jew would drink from it. And that was obviously no problem for him. Another way that Jesus was defying the social norms and talking with her was he's engaging with her in theological and deep conversation. He's interacting with her ideas and questions. He's seeing her. He's respecting her in that conversation. Now, at first, she only understands Jesus' metaphor about living water, she's only seeing it literally. But her openness and her intellect soon begin to connect. And I would suggest that's another contrast to that Nicodemus I talked about. Because Jesus uses a metaphor with him too about being born again. He never gets it. So another contrast in this story. So things are going so well. And my question is always, why did Jesus ruin everything? Doesn't it seem like Jesus just ruined everything? Like, what are you doing? Like, why are you all of a sudden going, bring your husband? Oh yeah, you've had 5. Like, when you read the text like that, it just sounds like a horrible, judgmental moment. Is that what's happening here? It seems like Jesus wants to shame her. Sadly, I feel like that's most often how this is preached or taught. Now, the next slide is just a small quote from a commentary. The reason for the woman's marital history intrigued commentators, but do not concern Jesus. And this next quote is very helpful to me. It's by a Dr. Karen A. Reeder. She says, "It is far more likely that she is actually a victim, another woman ill-used in a patriarchal society, divorced or abandoned or widowed by older husbands in succession. That is more likely than it is likely that she's a promiscuous woman." So, if Jesus isn't being judgmental, or what is he doing then? Why is he pointing this out? Well, do you remember from the story that she was asking him, "Are you a prophet? Like, you're going to give me this living water? Or you think you're greater than our great ancestors?" And so she's sort of challenging him, "Are you a prophet?" Now, at that time, the way that a prophet identified themselves or authenticated that they were a prophet was that they knew things about you they shouldn't know. So really what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, "I know about you. I know about your life." And that's why she accepts this and goes, "Oh, okay. You know stuff about me you shouldn't know. You must be a prophet." So it's interesting to me that Jesus reveals himself as a prophet to her, knowing all about her life, but makes no moral judgment. That's not the issue here at all. What I would suggest to you is that Jesus is saying this: I see you. I know you. I love you. I know your journey. I know your struggles. I see and feel your wounding. And it's the very reason that I offer you this gift of living water. Is living water some weird, mystical, eternal life thing? I don't know. But I think living water is this beautiful picture of belonging, of a God that says, "I love you and accept you for exactly who you are. I don't judge you. You belong. You are family. You are accepted. I see you. I know you. I love you." So I ask you, as I ask myself today, are we thirsty for hope? Do you sometimes feel that God and others only see your flaws or your pain? Who wants to be known or judged just for your flaws or pain? Can we allow this living water, this gift of life, this gift of no judgment, belonging, mattering, being seen, family, the gift of living water? Can we also give living water away by listening to people, by seeing and feeling with people, by acknowledging and empathizing with their pain, yet seeing them with dignity? I think responding to people in that way is giving living water. So one more part of the story. Hurry on here. So after all of this, now the theological debate happens. So now that she recognizes, okay, this stranger is talking to me, prophet, all right, I've got a prophet here, it's time for all my theological questions to be answered. So she brings up the big dispute that has always been between the Jews and the Samaritans. And that primarily is, where do you worship? So the Jews, you got to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans, you got to worship at the holy mountain. Jesus doesn't pick a side. Instead, he says, doesn't matter. There is a new era that is on us now, where all people of all nations, there's no longer barriers in any way because of sexuality, because of race, because of ethnicity, because of anything that's happened in the past. All nations, all people can come and worship God. God comes to all people and all creation. That's the new era. And so when Jesus declares that the kind of worship that God wants is spirit and truth is not a formula. It's not a declaration of exclusiveness. It's an invitation to freedom and seeking a God who loves and lives in all. So as the disciples return, all confused, she leaves her bucket behind and goes into the city. But she's still processing. She's still uncertain. But it's interesting that her lack of certainty, or all that she's wrestling with, doesn't stand in the way of her encounter or her witness of meeting Jesus. And because of her story, because of her witness, many in Samaria become Jesus followers. When I think of this, I ask myself, do my doubts, your doubts, do you often feel perhaps that spirituality is much more about mystery than certainty? I think that's good. I think that's true. I think it is. And so I think in the midst of our doubts, in the midst of the mystery, there's the beauty. And the beauty is this message of hope, this message of living water, this message of inclusion and invitation to all. So we're invited today to join Photine, Saint Phoenicia of Samaria, in a freed relationship with Jesus, freedom from religious and cultural and ethnic restrictions and barriers. That's living water. That's what we're invited to. I close with a little reading from this author named Rachel Held Evans. And if you know this author, sadly she died very young. But she wrote a little excerpt on this story called The Water. And I'll read the first part, and then the last slide is the final stanza. But she says this: "At that, he handed me the bucket of water. I brought it to my lips. I lifted my head and drank deep of the coolest, richest water I had ever tasted. I drank and drank and drank. I drank until I could no longer breathe. When I finished, I wiped my mouth on my sleeve and handed the bucket back to the man, who, to my amazement, threw his head back and gulped the rest of it down, dousing his dusty face with the last splash that remained. For a moment, I doubted what I had just witnessed. This man, this Jew, this Messiah drank from my defiled cup, and with relish. He saw my surprise and laughed, the deep belly laugh of a man who sees our religious absurdities for what they are. I joined him, all the tired and thirsty cells in my body awake with life once again. It was like giving birth and being born at the same time.